Rachel Berkheimer was born on January 16, 1984 in Everett, Washington, which is a city that is located 25 miles north of Seattle and sits on the banks of the Puget Sound, which is a large inlet of the Pacific Ocean. At the time of her birth, Rachel's parents, Bill and Denise, already had one child, a daughter named Megan, and so when Rachel arrived, they decided their family was complete. Initially, there was some concern that Rachel could have some health issues because by the time she was 2.5 years old, she still was not talking, and so her parents were concerned she could be deaf. But shortly after they went to a specialist about her hearing, Rachel would say her first words, and then from that point onward, her parents could not get her to be quiet. As a youngster, Rachel had a huge imagination. In preschool, she would pretend her fingers were imaginary friends and she would speak to them during class, often getting in trouble because of this. She also had a prized collection of troll dolls, who she gave very intricate backstories to. By the time Rachel was in grade school, she had developed a keen sense of humor. Specifically, she had the gift of mimicry. She could basically become any of her friends or her family members, and everyone thought it was really funny. In addition to her bubbly personality, Rachel was also a very gifted athlete who was always one of the very best players on her basketball, soccer, volleyball, or track team. All this despite growing to be only 4 foot 11 inches tall. Speaking of her smaller stature, even though she was not self-conscious about it, Rachel did wear 4-inch platform shoes virtually everywhere she went, including just going out to the mailbox. In high school, unsurprisingly, Rachel became very popular. Her father joked that he was her answering machine because her many friends would call the house day and night looking for her. But despite this abundance of friends, Rachel took all of her relationships very seriously. She never forgot anybody's birthday, and she would even sometimes send out these random cards that weren't even on birthdays to her friends and to her family members, just telling them how much she loved them. By 2001, when Rachel was 17 years old and in her 3rd year of high school, it just seemed like she was this amazing person who was destined to live a totally charmed life. However, this would not last. Of all of her friends, Rachel's best friend was an 18-year-old boy named Corey Haynes. She had met him when they were young, and they had quickly become soulmates, at least according to their families. However, their relationship was not a romantic one. It was more of a brother-sister style relationship. They spent nearly all of their time together, and in the rare times they were not together, they could always be found speaking on the phone. In the summer following Rachel's 3rd year of high school, Corey was riding in a car with 3 other students from his and Rachel's school. Rachel was not with them. And at some point, the driver of the vehicle lost control of it and started to flip off the road. And when it finally came to a stop 100 feet away from the road, Corey and one of the other student passengers, a 17-year-old named Levi Whiting, were both unfortunately deceased. When Rachel heard the news about this crash, she fell apart. Not only was Corey literally her best friend in the world, but she was also very close with Levi as well. And so over the rest of that awful summer, Rachel spent most of her time crying in her bedroom, looking at pictures of her and Corey and her and Levi. Her older sister, Megan, would say that Rachel was just beyond heartbroken. It was like all of the joy and happiness that normally characterized her was just gone. Finally, that summer did come to an end, and it was time for Rachel to return to Marysville-Pilchuck High School to begin her 4th and final year. Her family hoped that finally being around some other students again would help heal her and help her move on, but unbelievably, over the course of that school year, 4 more students, all of whom were friends with Rachel, would die. There was a suicide, there was a drowning, a hit and run, and an accidental shooting. It was like the school was cursed. By the second half of that school year, Rachel, like many other students at the school, had become deeply depressed. The trauma of losing so many people close to her had just crushed her spirit. When her grades, which were normally quite good, began to decline dramatically, her parents pulled her from the high school and enrolled her in an alternative high school. They also began sending her to grief counseling. But not long after joining this alternative high school did Rachel drop out, so she did not get her high school diploma. Her parents were not happy about this decision, but they did understand their child's life had been completely disrupted in a catastrophic way over the past year. I mean, the trauma she had experienced already as this young person was more than what most adults would experience in their entire lifetime. And so they honored their daughter's decision to drop out, and they just gave her some space to try to figure out what she wanted to do next. After dropping out of school in the spring of 2002, Rachel got a job at a local pizza and pasta shop in town, but after only a couple of months, she quit. She did pick up some hours babysitting that summer, but for the most part, she spent her time just sitting in her room, alone and sad. Then one day, her father looked at the family's phone bill and saw it was significantly higher than normal. When he reviewed all of the individual charges, he saw there was one that really stood out to him. There were dozens and dozens of collect calls that had been placed from an inmate at a correctional facility. When he confronted his daughter about these calls, she would tell him that yes, she was speaking to an inmate at a correctional facility, and his name was John Anderson. He was 20 years old. He went by Diggy, that was his nickname, and that she and Diggy were in this sort of new romantic relationship. She told her father that she had met Diggy a year earlier at a high school party. This was before he was sent to jail on drug and burglary charges, and he had been very interested in her at the time, but she wasn't interested in him. Despite the rejection, though, Diggy continued to pursue Rachel well after this party, but it wasn't until a year later, when she had dropped out of high school, that she finally decided to give him a shot. Rachel would tell her father that Diggy, despite being a convicted criminal, was very misunderstood. He was actually a very nice guy who just had a troubled past, and that was why he kept getting in trouble with the law. Her father did not approve and was very worried about his daughter, but he wanted to be supportive and felt like he didn't really know the whole situation, and so he just told her, please just be careful. Not long after this father-daughter talk, Diggy got out of prison, and so Rachel, who had spent the better part of the last year shut up in her room, was now suddenly going out all the time to see him and his group of friends. It's important to understand here that Diggy and his group of friends were in reality just a group of petty criminals and drug dealers for the most part. However, they thought of themselves as a full-fledged, organized criminal gang, and they were very proud of it. And they even referred to themselves as the Northwest Mafia, and Diggy was very clearly their leader. Quickly, it became apparent to Rachel's family that a big part of, quote, spending time with Diggy and the Northwest Mafia was partying and doing drugs and drinking alcohol. And so naturally, the parents were very concerned for their daughter, who they felt was really starting to go down the wrong path in life. So over the next couple of months, Rachel's parents and her sister all tried to gently convince Rachel to stop spending so much time with Diggy and his crew because they were a totally bad influence on her. But Rachel was adamant that Diggy and his crew was making her happy, and that right now, that was what she needed, that she needed to be around them, that they were really just awesome people, and that you gotta trust her. And her family, they didn't trust her. They felt like, maybe she's going through a phase where she wants to date, a bad boy. They didn't really get it, but they also didn't have a way of getting through to her. It seemed like she was just convinced this is what she needed to be doing now, and so they just were kind of at a loss. Then, one day, it seemed like everything had just magically fallen into place. It was on a sunny morning in late July of that year. Rachel's father was outside working on his garden when his daughter, Rachel, suddenly appeared looking happier than she had in a long time. Bill smiled back at her and was like, "What's going on? Why are you so happy?" And she would tell him that she had a plan. She was going back to school and she was going to become a medical technician. And she was just absolutely beaming as she's telling him this news. When she was asked what had brought about this incredible change, she explained that she had recently made a new friend who was encouraging her to do this. She said his name was Maurice Rivas. He was 18 years old like she was, and he was a part of the Northwest Mafia. She told her dad that she had previously interacted with him when she first started seeing Diggy a few months earlier, but she had never really had a real conversation with him. She'd only just kind of waved and said hi whenever they were at gatherings together. But a few days earlier, when she was at a Northwest Mafia party, she and Maurice just kind of happened to find themselves alone, and so they struck up a friendly conversation. And during that talk, Maurice confided in Rachel that he was actually really unhappy, and he wanted to leave the Northwest Mafia, and he wanted to go back to school since he had actually dropped out of high school as well. And when Rachel heard him say this, she had an epiphany. She realized she felt exactly the way he did. She didn't like being in the Northwest Mafia. She didn't even know why she was in the Northwest Mafia. She didn't know why she was seeing Diggy. And it was like it all clicked for her. And so she confided in Maurice, this guy who she barely knew. She said, you know what? I feel the same way. I don't want to spend time with these people. I want to go back to school. And so this random conversation they had at this party really immediately bonded them together. It was like they both had been harboring this deep, dark secret, but now only with each other, they could discuss it openly. And it was very liberating for them. And so by the end of this first real conversation they had had, the pair had promised each other that they were going to get out of the Northwest Mafia. They were going to go back to school. They were going to clean up their acts. They were going to fix their lives. And they were going to do it together. They were going to support each other and have each other's back. Rachel would even joke with her father that they were already talking about when they went back to school that they would go to senior prom together, although she assured her dad that their relationship was totally platonic. This was not a romantic thing. Bill, her father, had no idea what to say. This was literally the best case scenario. It was the thing her family had been hoping for over these last several months, and it seemed like it was finally happening. And so he told Rachel he was so proud of her. He gave her a big hug and said, look, if you need anything, just let me know. And Rachel smiled and she gave him a hug back. And then she turned around and skipped back inside the house. And sure enough, over the next 2 months, Rachel did act very differently. She started very intentionally getting her life back together. She started spending more time at home with her family, and she started going to church with her mom, and she also began reconnecting with some of her older high school friends who had always been a positive influence on her. And so by September of that year, Rachel did seem like she was more or less back to her old happy self. Except there was one element of her life, of her old life, so to speak, that she was not able to shake. And that was her relationship with Diggy. She just could not end it. She had tried to, but apparently he didn't want to break up. And so they fell into this sort of weird on and off again relationship that kept Rachel periodically going back to these Northwest Mafia gatherings. Her family was obviously unhappy about this particular detail, but they did feel confident that given her recent changes, that she would eventually break it off for good with Diggy. And so until that happened, they were actually quietly grateful that her new friend Maurice was also still spending time with the Northwest Mafia. He too was kind of struggling to fully break contact with them. And so the family was thinking, well, yeah, they do need to leave, but for the time being, when they're at these gatherings, at least they'll have each other. On September 23rd of that year, Rachel was invited to a Northwest Mafia get-together, and she did agree to go. Before she left her house, she did not give her family very much information about what she was doing or where she was going. All they knew was that apparently she was going out to see some friends. And so that night, when Rachel did not come back home, her family was definitely concerned about her, but they assumed she must have made plans to stay out at this friend or friend's house for the night. And since she didn't have a cell phone, they couldn't call her to confirm that. And so they just had to wait until the next day to see if she would show up again. But the next day arrived and Rachel did not show up again. And when her family began calling around to her various friends' houses, both old and new, no one seemed to know where she was. For a couple of days, the family continued to call around town and even drove around town putting up posters, asking people to come forward if they had seen her, but there was no sign of her. And so finally, on September 27th, the family went to police and they officially reported Rachel missing. The police immediately jumped into action, sending out units to scour all corners of Everett, Washington, and the surrounding areas. They also began questioning virtually anyone who was even remotely affiliated with Rachel in hopes they might know something. But despite this really aggressive initial push by police, it led to nothing. Then, out of nowhere, someone very unexpected came forward and gave the police a huge tip. And this tip would ultimately lead police to discover the truly unbelievable story of what happened to Rachel. The following is that story. After leaving her house on the afternoon of September 23rd, the day she told her family she was going to see friends, Rachel made the short drive over to 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace's house. He was going to be the host for that evening's get-together with the Northwest Mafia. When she arrived, Nathan, along with Rachel's good friend Maurice and a 17-year-old named Matthew Durham, were sitting in the living room, and while they waited for more friends of theirs to arrive, Nathan's father suddenly came home. Apparently, he had gotten off work early, and so not wanting to hang out around the prying eyes of a parent, the trio decided it would be better if they just left and spent their night at someone else's house. And so they made their way over to Kevin Jihad's house. Kevin was a 32-year-old, and he owned his own place. When they arrived, they found Kevin, along with 22-year-olds John Whitaker and Jeffrey Barth, and 20-year-old Tony Williams, all sitting around in the living room, just kind of joking around. They're playing video games, they're drinking alcohol, and they're smoking marijuana. Rachel, along with Maurice, Nathan, and Matthew, just took up spots on the couch right near the entrance to the room, and before long, they were joking around and having a good time too. At 4 p.m., Rachel's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Diggy, stormed into Kevin's living room looking furious. Without warning, he punched two of the guys sitting nearest Rachel, and then he pulled out a gun and he began aiming it wildly around the room. And this instantly silenced the group because no one knew what he was on about. And Rachel, who's sitting right near the door, she does not want to be part of this, and she's thinking this has nothing to do with me, and so she decides she's going to get up and kind of slip out and let them deal with Diggy and whatever is going on in here. And so she stands up, trying to be as quiet and small as she can, and she begins edging towards the door. But in order to fully leave the living room and escape this situation, she would need to walk right past Diggy, who was standing in the doorway. And as she got closer to him, about to make that move out of the room, Diggy seemed to notice her, and he put his gun down, and he turned to face her, and then he turned his whole body, so he was squared up with Rachel, as if he was getting ready to fight her. And then Rachel just kind of tried to make herself as small and as timid as she possibly could, and she tried to just slip past him, but right as she did, Diggy reached out with his left hand, and he grabbed her scalp, he grabbed her hair, and then he wound up and he blasted her in the face with his right hand, and then with his left, he kind of chucked her back into the room she had just tried to escape from. And then the worst night of Rachel's life would begin. As soon as she hit the floor in that room, she tried to scramble back to her feet, but before she could, she was getting punched and kicked by Diggy and several other of her friends who had just been sitting in the room joking around with her, and then the others who were in the room who were not actively participating in beating her, which included Maurice Rivas. They sat there idly doing nothing while Rachel screamed for their help. When her screams got so loud, Diggy was concerned the neighbors would hear her. One of the idle onlookers in the room, 20-year-old Tony Williams, simply turned the music up to drown her screams out. After a few horrible, violent minutes, Diggy told the others to stop, at which point he reached down and he grabbed Rachel's hair again and dragged her out of the room, and then he dragged her across the kitchen floor and through a door that led into the garage. Once she was inside the garage, he jammed a dirty sock into her mouth and he covered her mouth over with duct tape, and then he bound her wrists and her body with rope, and then once he was certain she could neither make any noise or go anywhere, he pushed her over so she was laying on her side, all bound up, and then he just left. He went back into the house and back into the living room with the others. What Rachel was not aware of was this entire night was a setup. Diggy was furious with her, most likely due to a combination of rage that she had tried to break up with him and just jealousy that she was now showing affection to other men in the group, such as Maurice and a few others. And so Diggy had ordered the other members of the Northwest Mafia to help put her in her place. It was unclear exactly what he meant by this, but all of the Mafia members knew this meant physically harming Rachel in some way, and they agreed to it. Originally, the plan had been to lure her to Nathan's house under the false pretenses of just a normal night hanging out with some friends, and then at some point, Nathan, Matthew, and her close friend Maurice would abduct her and bring her to Diggy for whatever else he had planned for her. But Nathan's dad had come home early before they could enact their plan, and so when that happened, Nathan had to sneak off and privately call Diggy and ask what to do next. And Diggy, who was totally frustrated by this, just said, you know what, bring her to Kevin's house and we will all deal with her when she gets here. So when Rachel sat down on the couch in Kevin's house next to Maurice and her other friends, who she thought she was just enjoying a fun night out with, in reality, they were all acting. They were trying to act like this was just another night and kind of get her off guard so that when Diggy came storming into the room pretending to be mad, which was the sign, they would all attack her. But now that the plan had worked and Rachel had fallen into their trap and had gotten badly beaten up and was restrained and helpless in the garage, Diggy didn't have a plan for what they were going to do next. So instead of doing anything, the 8 guys who had just beaten up and restrained Rachel just simply went back to doing drugs and drinking and playing video games in the living room. Then, a few hours later at 9 p.m., Kevin's girlfriend, Trissa Connor, she came home, and when she did, she entered the house through the garage. And when she saw Rachel laying on the ground, restrained, badly beaten up, her left eye is totally swollen, she ran over to her because, one, she actually didn't know who Rachel was. So this is just a random girl in her garage that's beaten up and restrained. And so she runs over to her, she rips the tape off of her mouth, she pulls the sock out, and right away, Rachel is pleading with her to let her go, she won't tell anyone, and Trissa is totally confused because she really has no clue what's going on. She was not a part of the plan to harm this girl, and so Trissa just instinctively runs into the house. She does not make any contact with the guys in the living room. She goes straight into the kitchen and she gets a knife, and then she runs back into the garage and she begins cutting through all of Rachel's restraints to free her. But before she could finish the job, Diggy apparently had heard the commotion of Trissa coming in and heard her running around the house. And so Diggy comes storming into the garage. He sees what Trissa is doing. He runs over and he grabs her hands and he physically stops her from freeing Rachel. And then he threatens Trissa that he's going to harm her if she lets Rachel go. And so Trissa, amazingly, at this point, despite clearly seeing something very bad is happening to this girl, instead of continuing to try to fight this and figure out what's going on and maybe try to help this girl, she just gets mad at Diggy and says, I don't want this in my house. What are you doing? I don't want this girl in my house. You know what? I'm going to call the cops if you don't get rid of her. Meaning, I don't care what you do with her, but I don't want this in my house. I don't want to be involved with whatever this is. And then she promptly begins to leave Rachel alone with Diggy. She starts walking away, and Rachel, she's heartbroken. This was her way out. She was about to be let go, and now Trissa is leaving her behind. And so Rachel's begging her to come back. Please, you gotta let me go. But Trissa didn't listen. She walked into the house and shut the door behind her. And then Diggy, who was still in the garage, he just immediately turned around. He tied Rachel back up. He stuffed the sock back in her mouth. He taped her shut. And then he went right back into the house and shut the door, leaving Rachel all alone again. But a few minutes later, Diggy would come back, this time with John Whitaker, and the two of them would show up with this black duffel bag, this huge bag. And they walk over to Rachel, who's now whimpering in the corner. She'd kind of pushed herself to the side. And they lifted her up and they forced her small body into this black bag, and then they zipped it shut. And while they did this, Matthew Durham, who had been in the living room, he had gone outside and gotten his red Jeep, and he had backed it up to the closed garage door. And then once Diggy and John had Rachel secured in this bag, they opened the garage door up and they put her in the back of the Jeep and they shut the Jeep's back door. And then Diggy ordered John, along with Matthew and Rachel's friend Maurice, who had just come outside, to just go drive around town with Rachel in the trunk until he, Diggy, figured out what they were going to do next. And so the trio hopped in the red Jeep and did what their leader told them to do. They began driving around Everett with Rachel in the trunk. And this whole time, Rachel could clearly hear anything that was said inside of the vehicle, but apparently during this initial drive around, the trio didn't talk. So it's unclear if she understood who was actually with her. But eventually, during this drive around, one of the 3 young men in the Jeep got a call from Diggy, who told them he had his plan, so come pick him up. At this point, the trio decide, for whatever reason, to just dump Rachel somewhere, basically stash her somewhere in her bag, and go pick up Diggy. And then once they had Diggy, they would go back, they would get Rachel, and then they would figure out what they were going to do. They'd hear the plan that Diggy had in store. And so Matthew drove the red Jeep about 10 miles north of Everett to a quiet cul-de-sac in this suburban neighborhood. And then once the Jeep was stopped, Matthew and Maurice got out and they went around to the back of the Jeep. They opened it up and they pulled Rachel out of the trunk and they walked her over and put her behind some big tree on someone's front property. Now, it's nighttime. This was not a well-lit up area. And so they thought by putting her behind this tree, she'd be out of sight of the road and, no one would see her. And they also decided that one of them would need to stay back and guard her to make sure she didn't escape or that nobody did accidentally find her. And they decided Maurice would be the one who would stay back and do that. And so after Rachel has been planted behind this tree, Maurice made his way over and he sat down next to her. And then Matthew and John, they just drove off in the Jeep to go get Diggy. And so once the Jeep had driven off, Rachel, who could clearly hear their discussions and she could hear the Jeep pulling off, she knows she is now alone with her good friend Maurice. And so this is her opportunity to plead with him to help her. And so as soon as she hears that Jeep is gone, she starts screaming through her gag on her mouth to try to get his attention. And it worked. Maurice quickly unzipped the bag and pulled her gag off, but he didn't untie her. And right away, Rachel, she is so upset. She's frantic. And she says to Maurice, "They're going to kill me if you don't get me out of here. You have to free me." And Maurice was just very nonchalant. And he said, "Yeah, I think you're making a big deal about this. You're going to be fine. Just go along with it. It's not a big deal." But Rachel couldn't believe what she was hearing. And so she's saying, "Maurice, don't you get it? They are going to kill me. This is the chance. Let me out. Save me. You're supposed to be my friend. Let me go." But Maurice just continued to do nothing. He just kept telling her it wasn't a big deal. She was blowing this up out of proportion. And then at some point, Rachel, after quite a bit of time had passed, and now she's thinking, Diggy and the others, they're going to be back soon. And so she says to Maurice, "You know what? If they're going to kill me, I just don't want to be drowned. I'm terrified of being drowned. At least make them shoot me. Make it quick." And at this, Maurice just doesn't say anything. And instead, he reaches down and he grabs the sock and he puts it in Rachel's mouth. He puts the tape over her mouth and then he presses her down into the bag and he zips it shut. And then he waits for Diggy and the others to come back. And sure enough, just a couple of minutes later, Matthew, John, and Diggy returned in the Jeep to the cul-de-sac. They got out and they lifted Rachel up inside of the bag and they brought her back over and put her in the trunk of the Jeep, which now contained 4 new shovels. And then once the trunk was shut, all 4 men piled inside as well. And then Diggy told Matthew to head out to a particular off-roading spot he was familiar with. It was about 30 miles to the northeast. And over the course of this hour-long drive, Rachel could hear everything being said inside of this Jeep. And she would have heard all the details of exactly what Diggy had planned for her. And so she knows what's going to happen to her, but she can't do anything about it. She's just bound in the back of this Jeep. And so around midnight, they reached their destination, this off-roading site, which was basically this thick forest at the foot of a mountain near a small pond. And once they parked, the men got out, leaving Rachel in the trunk with the trunk shut. And they began walking around the back of the vehicle and started looking on the ground until Diggy said he had found a spot that he really liked. And it was about 10 or 15 feet behind the vehicle. And so once this spot was identified, the men walked back to the Jeep, they opened up the trunk, and they left Rachel, but they pulled out their shovels. Diggy, John, and Matthew, they all took their shovels and walked to this designated spot on the ground, and they began digging, but Maurice didn't. He stayed back at the Jeep, standing right against the trunk with Rachel right behind him. So again, he has this opportunity where, in theory, he could help Rachel, but while she whimpered behind him and tried to get his attention and tried to get him to help her, he just ignored her, and he pulled out a cigarette and he began smoking, and he also had a soda that he was drinking. And so he's just standing there doing nothing. And at some point, Diggy looks up and notices this, and he yells at Maurice to come help them, get your shovel and start digging. And so Maurice, reluctantly, puts his cigarette out, throws his soda can away, and then he grabbed the last remaining shovel, and then he walked away from Rachel and the Jeep over to this site, and he began to dig as well. For the next 30 minutes or so, Rachel, who's still in the trunk is open, she's still in the bag, she's forced to listen to the sound of these 4 people dig what sounds like a very sizable hole. And then when they finally stopped digging, she heard them chuck their shovels aside and start walking back over to her. And when they reached her, they unzipped the bag and they pulled her out and they sat her down on the back of this Jeep. So she's kind of sitting, looking in the direction of this dig site. And as they begin cutting off her restraints and removing the tape from her mouth, she gets a clear view of what they had been digging. And she knows immediately what it is. They were digging her grave. After all the restraints and everything was off of her, Diggy ordered John to start taking all of her clothes and jewelry off. Rachel knew at this point she was about to die. There was nothing she could do to stop it. She was outnumbered. She was in the middle of nowhere. She would have been overpowered. So she knows she's going to die. And so she had nothing to lose. And so when John grabbed her and tried to rip her clothes off, She fought back aggressively, and she looks at Diggy and she says, "At least allow me the dignity of removing my clothes and jewelry myself." And so Diggy looks at her and he says, "Fine." And so all of the men back up, and then Rachel, in front of these 4 people who earlier that day she would have considered her friends, she began taking all of her clothes off. And then after she had removed all of her clothes and all of her jewelry, she left one ring on her hand, and she clutched it with her other hand, and she looked at Diggy and said, "Can I please just keep this one?" The ring she was holding on to was a ring that her good friend Corey Haynes had given her right before he was killed in that car accident. And Diggy just says, "No." And he reaches out and he literally pulls it off of her hand. And so standing there completely naked and alone and terrified, Rachel was then ordered by Diggy to start walking towards the grave. And so Rachel, with as much grace as she could muster, stood up straight, took a deep breath, and began walking. And then she finally reached the edge of the grave, at which point Diggy told her to walk down inside. And so Rachel very carefully turned around and lowered herself down into the grave. And then she stood up in the middle of the grave with her back to her attackers, at which point Diggy said, "Get on your knees." And so she did this, and as soon as she was down on her knees, she looked skyward and she pressed her hands together and put them right up against her chest, and she began praying. And as she's looking upward towards the sky, Diggy laughs at her and says, "Don't worry, you'll be up there soon." And then Diggy pulled his gun out, he aimed it at her back, and he began firing the gun. And he shot several times into the back of her head, into her back, and then his gun jammed, at which point he cleared the jam, he reloaded his gun, and then fired even more shots into her body. And then he put his gun away, and he, along with the other 3 men who had just witnessed this and participated in this, used their shovels to fill the hole back in, covering her up. Once she was buried, the men rounded up all of her things, along with the shovels and the murder weapon, and they chucked it into the nearby pond. Diggy made sure to crush the ring Rachel had said was so important to her before he threw it into the water. Then the men climbed back into the red Jeep and they drove back to Everett. And on the ride, Diggy would tell them that if they told anyone about what they had just done, he would kill them too. But just a few days later, after Rachel had been reported missing, the mother of Jeffrey Barth. Jeffrey was someone who had been at Kevin Jihad's house on the night Rachel was abducted, and he also played a role in her capture. His mother, Jeffrey Barth's mother, behind his back, went to police and told them that she thought her son knew something about Rachel's disappearance. And so the police, they rushed to Jeffrey and they interviewed him, and he would quickly say, "Oh, I don't know anything, but you should talk to Matthew Durham." Matthew, if you remember, was the driver the night Rachel was killed. He also helped dig her grave and he witnessed her murder. And when police spoke to Matthew, at first he refused to speak and tried to act tough, but when the police ratcheted up the pressure, he cracked and he told them everything, including where to find Rachel's body. And as soon as it became clear the police had Rachel's body, every other member of the Northwest Mafia who had been involved in Rachel's murder rushed to speak with the police because they were all trying to save themselves by blaming the other people in the group. And so that is why we have such a clear picture of exactly what happened to Rachel in her final moments, because those responsible told the police everything. During their trials, all 8 of the accused Northwest Mafia members were smug and did not take responsibility for their actions. But the worst of all of them by far was Diggy. During his trial, he smiled, and he even repeatedly turned around to look at Rachel's family so he could laugh at them and wink at them. Ultimately, all 8 of the accused were found guilty of various charges ranging from rendering criminal assistance all the way up to first-degree murder. 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace, whose home was supposed to be the site of the kidnapping, was sentenced to 116 days in jail. 20-year-old Tony Williams, who turned the volume of the music up to drown out Rachel's screams, and who also got the duct tape for Diggy when he was restraining Rachel in the garage, he received slightly more than 9 years in prison. 22-year-old Jeffrey Barth, who played a large role in subduing and kidnapping Rachel, and whose mother had gone to police and tipped them off about what had happened, he received 10 years in prison. 18-year-old Maurice Rivas, who was Rachel's closest friend in the group and who had pledged to support her and have her back as they got their lives together, he was sentenced to nearly 26 years in prison for assisting in Rachel's abduction and helping dig her grave. 17-year-old Matthew Durham, who drove the Jeep that carried Rachel to her death and who also helped dig Rachel's grave, he received 26 years in prison. 32-year-old Kevin Jihad, who was determined to have masterminded the finer details of the abduction and the murder. He was sentenced to nearly 37 years in prison. 22-year-old John Whitaker was sentenced to life in prison for being directly involved in the entire abduction and murder process. And 20-year-old John Diggy Anderson, the leader of the Northwest Mafia and Rachel's ex-boyfriend, he was also sentenced to life in prison for his role in her murder. Throughout Rachel's horrible ordeal, there were many people who could have stepped in and stopped what was happening to her, most notably Trissa Connor, who was Kevin Jihad's girlfriend and who found Rachel tied up in the garage, and Maurice Rivas, who was alone with Rachel in that cul-de-sac and could have easily freed her, but didn't. As a result of these heart-wrenching details, Rachel's family and their legal team worked very hard to pass a bill called SHB 1236. This bill makes it a criminal offense in America if you do not summon assistance for a person that has suffered substantial bodily harm. They are hoping this will save at least one person from suffering unnecessarily. Today, the Berkheimer family is still grieving the loss of their Rachel. However, her father, Bill, takes solace in a particular photograph the police showed him. After Rachel's gravesite was discovered and her body was removed from it, the police took a photo of the grave itself. And in this photo, you can see an imprint in the soil of Rachel's hands where she fell after she was shot. And it looks like her hands were pressed together near her chest, meaning she was likely praying in her final moments on Earth. And Bill likes to believe that means she was at peace when she finally died. In 2007, Barbara Bullock was a 55-year-old, fit, happy, healthy woman living in Montana with her husband of 14 years. In July of that year, her husband's cousin named Donna and Donna's boyfriend named Jim Rawmaker came to stay with them for a couple of days. On the evening of the 17th, Barbara offered to take the couple hiking with her the following morning at her favorite hiking spot, which was this totally unspoiled wilderness area on the border of Idaho. Barbara liked to hike a particular trail that brought her up to the Bear Creek overlook that had this incredible view down to the valley below. The couple happily agreed, but the following morning, Donna was not feeling so good, so she couldn't go on the hike. But her boyfriend, Jim, was still feeling up for it and said, "I'd still like to go." And so he and Barbara wound up doing the hike on their own. At 1:30 that afternoon, Barbara's husband got a phone call from a police officer saying his wife was missing. And her husband just couldn't understand that. Barbara hiked in that area all the time, and she had been with Jim, so where could she have gone? But the police officer didn't have a great answer, and he just told him, "You should come down here and hear Jim's explanation about what happened." When Barbara's husband arrived at the park, he rolled right up next to the officer and Jim. He got out, and Jim, who was in total shock, began to explain what happened. He and Barbara had made it up the trail successfully to the Bear Creek overlook. They'd stayed up there for about 30 minutes. They had a picnic, and they were enjoying the scenery. And then at the end of it, they packed up, and Barbara began walking down the very well-marked trail, and she was about 20 feet ahead of him when he decided to turn around and take one more look at the beautiful view. And he said he was looking at the view for about 40 seconds before he turned back around and Barbara was gone. And he hadn't heard her call out for help. He hadn't heard her fall. There was no sound of other people. There was no sound of other animals. There was no sound of any struggle whatsoever. It was just complete eerie silence. And as he took a few steps down the trail, he said he started looking around, expecting to just see her behind a tree or something, but she was nowhere. And as he walked, he noticed that the ground underneath every step made a lot of noise because there was lots of loose rocks and shale all over the ground. And so he stopped and he's listening really intently to see if he can hear where Barbara's gone, but he doesn't hear anything. And he's thinking, how could she have gotten away from me without me hearing the sound of her footsteps? And then he also began looking around and realized the area they were in, this trail, it was well trafficked. And so it was not very densely forested. You could actually see a pretty good distance in all directions because there was enough space between the trees. And so he's looking around thinking there's almost nowhere to hide. And so Jim started to feel scared and just began walking down the trail, expecting to run into her at any moment, but he didn't. And he kept turning around and looking behind trees and rocks. And he's thinking, this is impossible. I should have seen her. I should see her now. Where could she have possibly gone? And so he made his way all the way down the trail, the whole time turning around and looking for her and yelling for her, but never getting any feedback from her. and he got all the way to the parking lot, and he saw her car was still parked in the parking lot. And he's looking around the parking lot, she's not out there, and he noticed a crew was working in the road. And he went up to them and he asked if they had seen her or anybody come out of that trail, and they said no. And so Jim's starting to panic. He ran right back up the trail, all the way back up to the Bear Creek overlook, hoping that along the way he would see some indication of where she went. But again, there was nothing on the trail. He gets up to the overlook, he's looking around, he's yelling for her, nothing. And so he ran right back down again and he contacted authorities. Over the next 48 hours, a huge search was launched all around this area for Barbara. It included helicopters and huge search teams and highly trained sniffing dogs, but nothing was found. There was no signs of foul play, there was no signs of an animal attack or some sort of abduction. There was nothing, not even her scent was found. Despite the fact that the dog's handlers knew exactly where her last position was, but none of the dogs picked it up, which is highly unusual. It really was like she had vanished into thin air. At first, Jim was obviously a suspect because he was the last person to see Barbara alive, but he never changed his story despite how far-fetched it seemed, and he was very cooperative and was very quick to offer to take a polygraph test, and so the police ruled him out as a suspect. And shortly after the search started, they shut it down because there was no sign of this woman anywhere. And so unfortunately, her family had to face the awful reality of getting zero closure. She was just gone and nobody knew what happened. And unfortunately, to this day, we still don't know what happened because no trace of Barbara has ever been found. Our next story is called One Sock. In late August of 2004, Kevin Bardsley and his 12-year-old son Garrett went on a father-son Boy Scout camping trip in the Uinta Mountains in northern Utah. Their campsite was situated next to Lake Quiberon inside of the Wasatch National Forest. The lake was actually pretty remote and difficult to access because it was almost completely surrounded by huge mountains. The only side you could get to the lake on was its western side, but the western trail leading to it was very cumbersome because you had to bypass 7 different lakes. And so by the time Kevin, Garrett, and the rest of the Boy Scouts and their fathers were at the lake, they were at least an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization. Early in the morning on August 20th, Kevin and Garrett woke up, they hopped out of their tents. None of the other campers had woken up yet, and so they decided they would head down to the lake to get some early fishing in. And so they got their gear and they began walking down the very well-defined 150-meter-long trail down to the lake. As they get there, the sun's coming up over the mountains, and they're really excited about their day of fishing. And so as Kevin is preparing a fishing rod for Garrett, Garrett was jumping around on different stones that were poking out of the water. And at some point he tripped and he fell into the water, soaking his shoes and his pants. And so he hopped out of the water and he's kind of laughing at himself, and he told his dad that he didn't care, he'd fish with wet feet and wet pants and he would change them later. And so Kevin laughed and handed his son his fishing rod, and then the two of them began to fish. After a while, when they hadn't caught anything, Garrett said to his dad that, "You know what, Dad, this is actually pretty uncomfortable. I'm going to go change my pants and my socks." And so Kevin said, "No problem. I'll be here with our gear. I'll see you when you get back." And so Garrett stands up and he starts walking back up the well-defined 150-meter trail back up towards the campsite. And Kevin actually turned around and watched his son disappear into the trees, but he heard the sound of other campers at the campsite and so knew his son wouldn't be alone. For the next couple of minutes, Kevin kept fishing, but periodically would look over his shoulder, expecting to see Garrett come out of the woods again, but he didn't. And after about 20 minutes, Kevin was a little bit concerned, so he picked up his fishing gear and began walking back up the trail towards the camp. When he got there, he saw other Boy Scouts and their fathers just getting up and having a bite to eat, and he's scanning around the campsite and he doesn't see Garrett. And so he goes over to Garrett's tent and he opens it up and Garrett's not in there, and there's no sign that he's removed any of his wet clothing in there. And so Kevin turns around and he asks one of the fathers, "Hey, have you seen Garrett? He was supposed to be up here a minute ago." And the father said, "No, I haven't seen him." And so Kevin's starting to panic and he yells out to the group, "Hey, has anyone seen my son? Do you guys know where Garrett went? He was supposed to be up here." And no one knew where he was. They said, "No, we haven't seen him." And so horrified, Kevin drops all of his gear and starts running back towards the lake, screaming for his son. And the other campers instinctively know what's going on, and so they chase after him, yelling for Garrett. Almost immediately, the sheriff's department was notified, and they launched this huge search that included the FBI. And so hundreds of people have descended into the area around the lake, and they're looking for Garrett. They can't find him. But later that afternoon, searchers were about a half-mile away from where Garrett was last seen, and they found a single Nike sock that appeared to have been removed from a wet foot wedged into one of the boulders in this huge boulder field. Garrett's mother would confirm that was Garrett's sock, and so the search effort was shifted to this big boulder field, and for days they looked all over the place for him, but there was no sign of Garrett anywhere, and so eventually the search was terminated. The authorities determined this was an accident, that Garrett's father and the other campers had nothing to do with Garrett's disappearance. What their theory was is Garrett must have gotten lost on the walk back to the camp and then ultimately died of exposure. But the idea that a boy of Garrett's age would get lost along a well-defined 150-meter-long trail that he was familiar with, that he had been on that day, that seems a little far-fetched. Also, as Garrett was walking down that trail, he would have heard the sounds of the other campers in the campsite. So that would have helped him figure out exactly where he needed to go. He's on a well-marked trail, he's walking towards the sound of the voices. But he never made it to the campsite because no one at the camp saw him, and there was no sign that he had put his wet clothes in his tent. So something happened to Garrett almost immediately when he left his father that caused him to wind up a half-mile away in a boulder field with one sock missing. It screams abduction case. But remember, this campsite was over an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization, and they know this group of Boy Scouts and their fathers were the only ones in the area that day. It is possible that an animal could have taken Garrett, like a mountain lion, but there would have been signs of a struggle, and they didn't find any on the trail or anywhere nearby, and you would figure if he was getting dragged off by a big predator, he would have yelled out for help, but he didn't. He just left his dad, it was total silence, and then he vanished, and all we have is his one sock. The next and final story of today's episode is called I'm Looking for You. At 5 a.m. on September 30th, 2008, a 61-year-old man named Xian Tie-Xiong finished getting dressed inside of the bedroom that he shared with his wife in the city of Beijing, China. After he finished getting dressed, Xian reached down and scooped up his backpack off the floor that was already packed, and then he carefully walked around his bed, trying to be as quiet as possible, and then as quietly as he could, he kind of tiptoed around the bed to his wife's side to give her a kiss goodbye. Xian was going to be heading out to a local mountain that day for a day hike. And so Xian, he gets next to his wife and he bends down to kiss her, and right as he does that, he accidentally wakes her up. And so his wife opens her eyes and she looks up at him, and Xian just says, I love you. He gives her a kiss and he tells her, hey, I'll be back tonight before midnight. And so his wife, she kind of groggily said, okay, and she grabbed his hand and squeezed it, and she told him that she loved him, and then she fell back asleep, and moments later, Xian had left the bedroom and walked out the front door. Xian's home was only a couple of blocks away from the train station, and since he needed to ride a train and then also a bus to get to this local mountain that was about an hour-and-a-half journey away, the train station was his first stop. And so Xian, as he walked towards the station, he was all smiles. He was really excited about this day. So Xian was retired, but he had spent his whole life teaching geography at Beijing No. 5 Middle School, and he was a very passionate teacher. But the thing he was most passionate about, that he routinely really pushed on his students, in some ways more than geography, was his love of nature. In fact, Xian loved nature so much that when he was not teaching, he basically spent all of his off time out in nature going for hikes. That was his thing. And today, Xian was especially excited about his hike because he was hiking one of his favorite trails. It was located on Mount Miaofeng, which is a mountain located 30 miles to the northwest of where Xian lived. And this mountain was quite famous because of all the sacred and ancient temples that kind of dotted the mountain all over the place. And then also there were all these beautiful roses, like the flower, that would bloom all over the mountain in the summer. And so it's just this totally strikingly beautiful place. And normally, Jian would actually hike up this trail and then actually camp out on Mount Miaofeng, mostly because on the summit, there was this incredible view of downtown Beijing. And at night, the view is like spectacular with the city all lit up. But on this particular day, Jian knew an overnight stay was not possible because he had to be back home by the next day because it was his mother's 90th birthday. And he was very close with his mother, and he was not going to miss that. And so Jian eventually made it to the train station. He bought his ticket, he boarded his train, and then he sat down in a seat. And as soon as he did, he opened up his bag and pulled out a stack of papers. For this hike, Jian had packed himself some food and water inside of his backpack. He also packed a newspaper called the Beijing Youth Daily, and he brought along his diary. But his diary was a little bit unique. Jian, because he loved nature so much and didn't like the idea of wasting anything, what he would do when he was a teacher at Beijing No. 5 Middle School, he would just take scrap paper and start writing on that. And he would compile all his scrap paper into these sort of diaries that he would keep. And so Jian passed the time on the train by writing in his diary, aka his stack of scrap paper, and also reading this newspaper. And Jian knew he really needed to read the entire newspaper pretty quickly, because by the time he got to the mountain, he was going to do what he always did, which is he would bring a newspaper with him on a hike, and as he walked, he would take out a page periodically and tie it to a tree, kind of marking his way. That way, when he turned around and came back down, he would have his path marked, because Jian did not always walk on a clearly marked trail, and so this was his way of not getting lost. And so Jian would ride the train car, and then he would get off and he would board a bus, and then finally, right around 7 a.m., that bus would come to a stop in the tiny village of Changfang, which is located right at the base of Mount Miaofeng. And so Jian grabbed his backpack, he hopped off the bus, and then began walking through the village towards the mountain. And then by about 7:20 a.m., so not long after Jian had left the bus, he was almost up to Mount Miaofeng when he pulled out his cell phone and he called his cousin. It was a brief conversation, and all Jian really wanted to do was just to make sure his cousin was going to be around the next day for Jian's mother's birthday. And the cousin said he would, and so Jian told him, okay, I'm going hiking today, and I will see you tomorrow. And then he hung up. And then, only a couple minutes later, Jian disappeared into the beautiful forests of Mount Miaofeng. So Jian's wife did not expect to hear from Jian at any point that day, because she knew he would have terrible cell phone service up on the mountain. But she did expect her husband to be home on time. He had told her that morning before he left that he would be home that night before midnight. And if you knew Jian, you knew this guy was never late. He said, I'm going to be someplace at a certain time, he would be there. So when 10 p.m. rolled around that night and still Jian was not back yet and he had not called, Jian's wife was actually not worried because she was thinking, okay, well, it's 10. He'll be home in the next couple of hours because he said he'd be here by midnight tonight and he will be here tonight. And so she went to bed expecting to wake up and see Jian in bed with her in the morning. But the next morning when she woke up, Jian was not in bed, so he did not come home, and so his wife immediately was very concerned and began calling Jian's family, and nobody knew where he was. And so that day, the family went to the police, and they reported Jian missing. The local police immediately organized a search for Jian. However, they knew this was going to be a very challenging search. Mount Miaofeng is not some enormous mountain by any means. It's a decent-sized mountain, but, it's really known for having these paths that twist and turn all over the place, so it's pretty easy to get lost. And then also there's a whole bunch of sheer cliff faces kind of all over the place, so if you're not paying attention, you could literally just walk off a ledge. So in short, this is a dangerous and confusing place. And at the same time that this search was happening out on the mountain, the police were also in contact with Jian's cell phone service provider to see if they could track down Jian's cell phone, because obviously if they could find that, they might find Jian too. but the only way a cell phone can be tracked is if the cell phone is on. Because when it's on, it connects to the nearest cell phone tower, and that's how these service providers are able to tell where these phones are. They look to see which tower it's connected to. But when Jian's cell phone service provider looked for his phone, they quickly determined his phone was off. So unless the phone came back on again, they would not be able to locate the phone. However, they were able to pull all of Jian's cell phone signal history up until his phone was turned off. And what they found in the signal history is the day before, so the day Jian went missing, his cell phone was on at 4 p.m. that evening, and he received a phone call at 4 p.m. And the service provider was able to see that when this phone call came in, Jian's cell phone was not where they thought it would be. It was not high up Mount Miaofeng, it actually was near the base of the mountain. And when police reached out to the person who had called Jian at 4 p.m., they discovered it was just a friend of Jian's, and this friend said that Jian said he was coming down the mountain now and he'd be home soon. So this new information did basically line up with what Jian had told his family he'd be doing that day, just a quick day hike, although again, they kind of expected it to be a little bit longer. It seemed a little odd he'd be down the mountain by 4 p.m., but still, this basically lined up with what they thought he was doing. However, this new information did not help explain what happened to Jian. Like, why was he missing? The expectation was he must have gotten lost or hurt or something up on this mountain. Maybe he's stranded somewhere and can't go anywhere. But now, based on this phone call, it sounded an awful lot like Jian was not even on the mountain when he disappeared. So where was he? Police had already checked all the bus stations and train stations in the area, to see if maybe Jian took a different way home or something. But when they went to all these different stations, there was no evidence that Jian had been to any of them. And there was another problem. Members of Jian's family told the police about Jian's habit of tying newspapers to trees to mark his trail as he hiked. And the family told the police that Jian did this every single time he hiked. And his wife told the police that for sure she knew her husband had brought along a copy of that newspaper. So by all expectations, there should be markers up on that mountain literally leading searchers to wherever Jian went. But after an entire day of searching Mount Miaofeng, they didn't find a single newspaper anywhere. For the next several days, this big search for Jian continued, but nothing was found. That is, until October 7th, so 1 week after Jian had vanished. On that day, Jian's cell phone service provider noticed that Jian's cell phone had suddenly turned back on. And the phone was not on or near Mount Miaofeng. Instead, it was located 36 miles away from the mountain at a train station called Beijing West Railway Station. Now, the cell phone was only on for a couple of seconds, but it was on long enough for the provider to confirm that it really was in that location. And so the police immediately dispatched a team to go to Beijing West Railway Station and see if they could find Jian. But when they got there, Jian was not there, his phone was not there. They looked at all the security footage, there was no sign of Jian. They searched the surrounding areas, nothing. And on this day, at basically the same time that police are at this railway station trying to make sense of, what's going on with the cell phone, a villager from Chanfang village, which is that little village that sits at the base of Mount Miaofeng, came forward with a very strange story. He said on the day that Jian disappeared, this villager was at his little shop. He sold walnuts to hikers that were making their way towards Mount Miaofeng. It was basically like snacks for the hike. And he sees this guy walking up through the village towards the mountain, and he looked exactly like Jian, because now Jian's face was on the news and this villager had seen it, and so he felt like he had seen Jian. And so this villager said, this guy who looked exactly like Jian, he walked up and actually stopped at this villager's shop to buy some walnuts. And this villager and this man who looked like Jian, they just chatted for a few minutes, and at some point, this guy who looked like Jian, asked the villager, hey, these are great, but where else can I buy walnuts? I want to buy other types of walnuts and bring them back to my family. And so this villager was like, oh yeah, well, the best walnuts in all of Beijing are actually located about 30 miles away at the base of another mountain. It's called Tietua Mountain, and there are vendors over there who sell the best walnuts. So that's your answer right over there. And then after the villager said this guy who looked just like Jian, it's like everything changed for him. It's like his expression changed, his tone changed. It's like he's been given this information that's changed his life, about these walnuts. And he says to the villager, okay, I'm going to go there right now. And without saying anything else, this man just turned and began quickly walking away from the walnuts, back through town, back towards the bus stop. So away from Mount Miaofeng. In theory, this guy is going to the bus to commute 30 miles to this other mountain, Tietua Mountain, to get these walnuts? I mean, the villager does not know this guy, but even he felt like this is bizarre. This guy comes up, he's buying snacks to go hike Mount Miaofeng. He seems really excited about it. And I offhandedly mention these walnuts and he's like, boom, I'm out of here. I'm going to go 30 miles to this other mountain to get these walnuts. It just seemed weird. And then when police spoke to Jian's family about this new information, they would learn that Jian did not have a special interest in walnuts, and neither did his family. And even if there was a reason why Jian just really wanted these walnuts, he would not have had time in that day to take the bus 30 miles to Tietua Mountain, get these walnuts, go 30 miles back, and hike up Mount Miaofeng, because he can't stay the night. He needs to come back tonight in order to go to his mother's birthday party the next day. So it just made no sense. But this walnut thing was basically the only lead police really had because everything else was a dead end. And so they decided to shift their search area from Mount Miaofeng to Tietua Mountain. And pretty much right away, they saw something that gave them hope that Jian could be here. They found pages from the Beijing Youth Daily newspaper tied to trees on the mountain. And when they looked more closely at the newspapers, they found the publication date of this newspaper lined up with the copy that Jian would have had with him on the day he vanished. And so, of course, the searchers just began following this trail of newspapers, hoping Jian would be at the other end. For 2 days, searchers very diligently followed this trail up the mountain. It kind of wound around, and they went pretty slowly because as they're moving, they're constantly checking everything around. They don't want to miss any clues. But finally, after 2 days of following this trail, they eventually found something. The newspapers led them to a campsite. Now, the campsite was abandoned, but there was a bed of hay, there was some used water bottles, and some toilet paper. And so just from the looks of it, this campsite looked relatively active, like somebody had been staying here recently for at least a day or two. And so it seemed pretty likely, based on everything else, that this was Jian's campsite. And pretty quickly, after searching the campsite, they found something that virtually guaranteed that this was his campsite. Authorities found this plastic bag that was sitting next to the bed, and inside of the bag was a piece of scrap paper from Beijing No. 5 Middle School. And on this scrap paper was a note. And the note said Jian had indeed hiked up Tietua Mountain on September 30th. This would have been the day that he left, so the day he disappeared. And then on his way down, he said he got lost and was forced to spend the night out here. And so that explained the campsite. And then on October 1st, so that would have been the day after he spent the night out here, he said he was going to attempt to follow the ridge line down the mountain to a nearby village to safety. And this note ended with the phrase, leaving this note here just in case, love to everyone who passes by. Now, at first glance, this note was like amazing news because suddenly it seemed totally possible that Jian was just fine. I mean, the way the note was written, it sounded like he was at least healthy and safe. Albeit, I'm sure he was not happy to be stuck up on a mountain, but, he loved being in nature, and so he seemed okay. And then he had a reasonable plan for how he was going to get out of there, follow the ridgeline, go down to a village, go to safety. But as the police analyzed this note, they noticed that some things were off about it. First of all, this note basically directly contradicts other facts of this case. Remember, cell phone records prove Jian got a phone call at 4 p.m. on the day he went missing from his friend, and his friend would report that Jian told him that he was coming down Mount Miaofeng and he'd be home soon. But according to the note they found, that was not possible because the note said Jian at 4 p.m. on September 30th, the day he went missing, he would have been on Tietua Mountain, either hiking up or being in the process of getting lost and, ultimately making that campsite where he camped out for at least one night. And so in addition to this factual discrepancy with this note, another issue with the note was just the way it was written. Now, Jian's wife had a chance to look at the note, and she would say, that is my husband's handwriting. But the note contained a bunch of very strange language choices that just didn't make sense for Jian to be using. For example, this note, which really should have been a first-person point of view, Jian has gotten lost, he's by himself, he's writing to the world, kind of letting somebody know what's going on with him, and so it really should have been written in the first person. My name is Jian, I am lost, here's what I'm doing. But the note was written in the third person. Jian got lost on the mountain, and so he is going to camp out for the night, and tomorrow he's going to make his way out to safety. But despite being written in the third person, it did sound like somebody was talking about themselves. It did not feel like somebody else was attempting to document what Jian was doing. But by far, the weirdest part of this note was the tone shift that happened about halfway through. So the first half of this letter was written, albeit in the third person, but it was grammatically correct and sort of formal, like you would expect from a very well-educated retired teacher. But once you get to that second half of the note, the grammar started being really awkward, and then the very final line, which says, love to everyone who passes by, that actually sounds totally awkward in Chinese. So, love to everyone who passes by is the translation into English, and that basically makes sense to us, like that's not an awkward phrase. But if you put it back in Chinese, it's so awkward. It would be like if I tried to say to you, I take the bus to work, but instead I said, to work, take bus, right? Like I wouldn't say it that way, and it would immediately seem very awkward for anybody who knows me if I wrote or said something like that. And so this last line stood out so much that actually police and friends and family of Jian assumed he must have left that in there as like a secret message or a code, like a distress signal. Especially when you consider the other weird factors around this note. But nobody could figure out what it meant. The day after this note was discovered, a searcher was up in the vicinity of Jian's campsite on Tietua Mountain, and they were walking around, kind of retracing their footsteps, looking for new places to search, when they turned a corner, and up ahead they noticed there was this tree kind of hanging out over this rocky cliff. And dangling from the tree was something gray that looked sort of out of place. And so the searcher, sensing this could be a clue of Jian's whereabouts, he yelled out for other searchers in the area that he had found something, and then he took off running towards this thing to see what it was. And when he got up to the tree, he looked up and he saw it was a pair of sweatpants that had clearly been intentionally tied to this branch in the tree. And so the searcher, he reached up and grabbed one of the pant legs and kind of tugged on it. And when he did, all these white things began falling out of the pants and landing on the ground. And when the searcher stopped and looked down to see what they were, he couldn't believe it. It was a whole pile of human bones. However, they were not Jian's. In fact, nobody ever figured out who these bones belonged to or why they were stuffed inside of pants and tied to a tree on this mountain. But the discovery of these bones would open up a whole new mystery because after these bones were found, all the searchers came over and basically just began combing the area near these bones, and the police began uncovering body after body after body. They found 2 more sets of human bones stuffed into pants and tied to trees, and they found the other bodies at the foot of a cliff, and also inside of this well, and inside of this cave. And so in total, authorities found 10 sets of human remains in the vicinity near Jian's campsite, but none of the human remains belonged to Jian. Officials were only able to identify a few of the bodies, and they were not able to figure out how they died or whether or not foul play was involved. But the discovery of those bodies did mean one thing for Jian's case. It meant, all these people had previously gone up Tietua Mountain before Jian went up and vanished, and when these other people went up the mountain, clearly something horrible happened to them, and we don't know what it is. Is there a killer on the loose? Is there some animal or creature out there that's taken people out? I mean, we don't know. But what started to happen since Xian went missing and his story was all over the news in China is that all these other hikers who've been on Tietua Mountain before have begun sharing their experiences when they hiked up Tietua Mountain, and some of their stories about what they've seen on that mountain are horrifying. One person said they were walking up the mountain, they had their partner with them who was a little bit farther back the trail, and so they're kind of walking up on their own, and the first person, as they're walking up the trail, suddenly sees this guy just kind of come out of nowhere wielding an axe, and he walks up to this person, and all he says is, "Are you alone?" And the hiker's like, "No, my partner's back there, they're coming up here, what's going on?" But the axe man, he basically acted like he didn't even hear their answer, and he just asked it again, "Are you alone?" And the hiker was like, "No, my partner's back there." And the Axeman again just said, "Are you alone? Are you alone? Are you alone?" And this axe person kept doing that until the hiker and their partner just turned and ran. And then another hiker shared a story about how they were walking up a trail on Tietua Mountain, and at some point they lifted their head up, and he saw a little ways up the trail, kind of off the trail, so in the tree line, were all these people, like this group of strangers, just standing there motionless, kind of half behind trees, like they were kind of trying to hide themselves, but also not. And they were just staring at this hiker, unmoving, not speaking, just staring. And so the hiker, they look up and they see this, and they were so unnerved so quickly that they just turned and left, and they have no idea who those people were. And so, obviously, we have no way of verifying these other hikers' stories about what they saw on Tietua Mountain. But when you combine their testimony with Xian's story, it really makes you wonder, what's going on up there? The official search for Xian was called off at the end of October, so roughly 1 month after he vanished. But unofficially, the search for Xian continues to this day. However, they still have not found his body, and basically no real progress has been made.